The traditional version of the Apostles' Creed in English says that Jesus suffered under Pontius Pilate, he was crucified, died, and was buried, and he descended to hell. To hell. To hell. And that phrase, he descended to hell, has always been a bit controversial, and people have wondered about its biblical warrant or lack thereof. You know, there is that tricky passage in 1 Peter 3:18-20 about Jesus preaching to the spirits in prison, but it's strange, it's unclear, it's vague, and there's a lot of interpretations there. Does it mean that Jesus went down to hell, or is it the preaching of the gospel in the days of Noah? There's a lot of things going on there, and even, I'm not sure about what's happening. So how can Jesus go to hell? I should add, too, that in biblical eschatology, there is a difference between the waiting place of the dead and the place of the wicked at the final judgment. You see, in the first instance, there's the place called Sheol in Hebrew, or Hades in Greek, and that describes the waiting place of the dead, which is distinguished from Gehenna, or hell, perdition, which is the final destination of the wicked after the final judgment. And hell can be described with a lot of different images. You've got a lot of language related to eternal darkness, being locked outside in the cold with chattering teeth, or a lake of fire. So hell can be a lot of different things. But what you need to know and take away is that there's a difference between Hades, the waiting place of the dead, and Gehenna, the place of everlasting destruction. And this is the problem we have, because sometimes Hades and hell get confused. They get wrongly conflated together. Now, let me give you an example of that. In the King James Version of Matthew 16:18, you got that, very famous passage in Matthew where Jesus says, "And I say also unto thee, that thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." Now, I say amen to that. But what if I told you in that famous passage, Jesus doesn't actually mention hell? Because if you look at the Greek text, the word is not Gehenna, it's Hades. It's not talking about Jesus building his church against the gates of hell, but rather against the gates of Hades. Or as I would translate it, Jesus is going to build his church, and even the doors of death will not be able to withstand it. And that's why in contemporary versions of the Apostles' Creed, they don't say Jesus went to hell, he descended to hell. They say something like Jesus suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, died, and was buried, and then they say he descended to the dead. Side note, I need to add something here. I don't think hell exists yet, or it's even been populated. If you look at the book of Revelation, John of Patmos describes something akin to the final judgment, where he says that there'll be a moment where death and Hades are thrown into the lake of fire. I take that to mean that hell currently has no occupants. Whatever hell is, place, realm, existence, destruction, everlasting terribleness, whatever it is, I don't think anyone's in there yet. So how could Jesus descend to hell, preach to people there, if no one's actually there yet? So did Jesus descend to hell, as the Old English version of the Apostles' Creed says? The answer is no, because between death and resurrection, he went to Hades, Sheol, the waiting place of the dead. Now, you might be with me up to this point saying, okay, that makes a lot of sense, that, hell and Hades have been wrongly conflated, and that's been read into the creed. But you might say to me, Mike, hang on, even people like Augustine and John Calvin believed that Jesus descended to hell. I mean, Augustine said only an infidel would deny that Jesus went to hell. And Calvin tried to have a bit of a bob both ways. And he said, well, maybe he didn't go to hell, maybe hell came to him. Or many of the reformers says, oh, well, he went to hell in the sense he really participated in death. That was their way trying to get around it. But a better explanation is that in our Latin witnesses of the Apostles' Creed, hell and Hades just got mixed up. In a nutshell, the problem seems to be that different words in Latin are used to describe where Jesus went between Good Friday and Resurrection Sunday. And there's this variation of wording that seems to create the confusion. Now, on the Apostles' Creed, it seems to have begun as a baptismal confession of the Roman Church, something probably confessed by new converts to the faith. It was written most likely in the late 2nd century, perhaps in Latin, or if not originally in Latin, it certainly became popularized in Latin, and it became one of the primary documents for teaching and creating new disciples and nurturing young believers in the faith. And in the original text, insofar as we can reconstruct it, it probably said that Jesus descended ad Inferos, which corresponds to various similar Greek phrases about, going to the lower depths or to the lower regions. But I want you to note that word Inferos, which means, like inferior, under, subterranean. However, later on, probably in the 5th century, as evidenced by a guy called Rufinus, a change was introduced into some Latin manuscripts of the Creed, so that the word Inferos, which means, underworld or lower depths, was swapped out for the Latin word Inferna, which is Latin for hell. So we had a change from Inferos to Inferna. Now, if you think about it, it's a very easy mistake to make. I mean, the two words are remarkably similar in sound, Inferos and Inferna. So it's easy. A scribe or someone reading this out could have said it, and maybe someone said Inferos, but what someone heard was Inferna. So at some point, it got changed in the creed from descended ad Inferos to descended ad Inferna. Okay, so this change, probably in the 5th century, is the root of the problem and the origin of the idea of Jesus descending not to Hades, but going to hell. And this is how hell and Hades got confused. They got treated as the same, as equivalents, and that carried over even into the Reformation churches, even over into Elizabethan English, hence the King James Version, and the traditional language of the Apostles' Creed says Jesus descended to hell. But we know biblically that that's not true. Jesus did not descend to hell. He went to Hades, to the waiting place of the dead. And it's only later on, when these words get confused, that the idea of Jesus descending into hell gets introduced. Okay, now that we've sorted out that Jesus did not descend to hell, we've also explained how this error was introduced through a few different renditions of the wording in the Latin text of the Apostles' Creed, and that was carried over. It still does lead to a pretty good question, doesn't it? What was Jesus doing between Good Friday and Easter Sunday? I mean, I like to think he wasn't having a holy dirt nap, catching some blessed Z's before, jumping out of the tomb like a rock star jumping on the stage, although he would have been within his right to do that. He is a bit of a a bit of a messianic rock star for my money? Well, the New Testament actually does give us a reasonable bit of information about what he was doing. I mean, the place to start with is Peter's Pentecost sermon, in Acts chapter 2, where Peter is preaching to the Jerusalemites, and he talks to the crowd, saying what happened to Jesus. This Jesus whom you crucified, God has made Lord and Messiah. And he along the way, he quotes Psalm 16, how the Lord would now not allow his servant to languish in death, and Peter, doing what the early Christians did, he reads the Psalms messianically. That's what they did with Psalm 2, Psalm 118, Psalm 110. Same thing here. He reads Psalm 16 messianically. This is about the Messiah, Jesus, who was not going to be left to languish in death, but he was going to be raised out of that pit. He was going to be taken out of Hades. We can jump back to 1 Peter 3:18 to 20, again, disputed text. But I think we could say that it means Jesus preached the good news, his gospel, of his victory over death, the devil, the anti-God forces of the cosmos, and he triumphed over them, and he preached them to the Old Testament saints. Not only that, if we look at Ephesians 4, now this is a disputed and it's a contested text, but I think it says that Jesus, descended and ascended, and he descended into the depths of Hades. He set free the captives in death and Hades, the Old Testament saints, and then when he ascended, he took them into heaven, and they're kind of like the gifts he's bringing to heaven. And then he bestows these spiritual gifts upon the church to celebrate these people who have been liberated from death. In Revelation 1, we have a great picture too of the risen Jesus telling John of Patmos, chapter 1, that he's triumphed over death, and he holds the keys of death. So death and all of its tyranny, its trauma, and its terror has been defeated in principle and will be ultimately defeated at the final resurrection. And I have to say, one thing I've learned to appreciate about the Greek Orthodox tradition, those guys and gals love Holy Saturday. Okay, they really love it. I mean, for most evangelicals like myself, we love Good Friday. In my place condemned he stood, when I cling to the old rugged cross, or in Christ alone and all that good stuff. Well, we got some resurrection stuff going on too, but for the Greek Orthodox, Good Friday is just the warm-up act to Holy Saturday. If you look at some of their art, some of their songs, some of their hymns, they celebrate Christ defeating death and liberating not just the Old Testament saints, but in effect, the entire human race. Adam and all of his progeny somehow set free from death. Yes, I know that can have universalistic connotations. It's not often intended that way. It can be taken that way. That debate's having in another seminar room, but they have this wonderful art and song and theology of Christ going down to death. That's where you get great songs like Christos Anesti Ektakron Thanaton Thanatopatisas Kektos in Nos Minas Sinzoin Karasamenos. Yeah, that's me singing some Greek liturgy. It means the Messiah has risen, trampling down death by death and giving life to those who are in the grave. That is the real big thing they celebrate at Easter in the Greek Orthodox Church. And that's why I love Romanos the Melodist. He was a 5th century Byzantine hymnist, and he wrote a great hymn called The Victory of the Cross, where basically the devil feeds Hades, the Son of God. And then Hades says, oh man, that's not sitting right. I feel really sick. And then he not only vomits up the Son of God who's released, the whole human race is burst forth out of Hades. And Adam says, you just swallowed the Son of God, sucker, and you got played. Because the whole human race is now making their journey towards paradise. It's kind of like that. That's the sort of thing they would celebrate in the Greek Orthodox Church at Easter. So anyway, I mean, I've written on this stuff in my books, Evangelical Theology, What Christians Ought to Believe. I'd also recommend two other authors to you, the works by Justin Bass and Matthew Emerson. They've also written very good books about Jesus descending to death, Hades. They go into all the Latin texts and all the different debates and traditions and that type of thing. So if you want to know more, I suggest you go read Justin and Matt's work on this topic. So there we go. Jesus did not descend to hell. Rather, he went down to Hades, announced his victory, and, to some degree took the souls of the righteous, the Old Testament saints, or Adam and the prophets, or someone back to heaven with him when he ascended. That's what really happened on Holy Saturday and the succeeding events thereafter. Hey, thanks for watching. Hopefully that's brought a bit of clarity to your own mind about, did Jesus descend to hell, and why modern versions of the Apostles' Creed say he descended to the dead. I mean, there's a bit of a backstory going on there. But if you like this video, and if you, don't want to miss out on future videos, then, subscribe, hit the notifications button. Also, if you've got a comment or anything I've discussed here, or, you've got a question, more importantly, let me know in the comments below, and I'll try and answer it. I've got some other cool videos coming out soon. Next one is probably going to be about the burial of Jesus. Was Jesus buried, or was his body just thrown around as carrion for, vultures and dogs and rats and scavengers? I mean, a few people have pushed that for you, so I'm going to do my next video on that. Otherwise, check out other videos on the channel, and yeah, I look to see you somewhere around the channel when the next episode pops up. Otherwise, please enjoy. The Lord bless you and keep you, and hope you enjoy celebrating the fact that Jesus descended to Hades for our redemption. Take care till then.